Are you afraid of the dark?
Boarded up windows, peeling forest green paint, short picket fence leaning and bowing on the end, worn down from time and element. A small pond that had gone drier than a bone, with neglected toys and inflatable animals laying where water used to be. A broken down swing set barely stood in the backyard on a dusty patch of earth adorned with weeds and dead flowers. Trees with hand-like branches reached down toward it like ghostly fingers to snatch up whoever was brave enough to come near. Graffiti littered the entire home on the outside, even the condemned sign clinging to its hook for dear life in the front yard had some unreadable nonsense scrawled on it in a festive green and red. The doors hung open, barely clinging to the hinges. She shouldn't be here. She knew it, she could feel it. But she had to. It was the only way she was going to find anything. They wouldn't haunt her if they didn't need her for something, right? She questioned herself then, and not for the first time. Was anything she saw or heard real? Was she crazy? No, she shook her head then. Too much added up. This was not in her mind. The steps groaned and cracked as she made her way to the back porch and peeked through the open door. A kitchen, worn down by years of abandon, smelled like dust and mold. Pots and pans still hung from a rack above a small island across from the stove, with blackened patches and rusted, stained burners. When she stepped inside, she was taken aback by the strong odor of mildew and almost reconsidered venturing further. It took her a moment to regain her bearings. She blinked wide and hard for a moment, pinched her nose, and shuffled on. It could only have been described as a lost place, trapped somewhere in time. It was as if it had simply been abandoned, its inhabitants vanishing. Frankie felt uncertainty and a creeping sense of unease as she stepped through the kitchen. Used china sat on the table, clothed in a layer of dust so thick the bugs even avoided it. A glass pitcher with what at one time must have been liquid sat in a greenish-yellow ring to the left of a gravy boat, cracked and worn down with time. A sterling silver platter with holes rusted through the bottom lay on the floor next to a cracked table leg that had been repaired in the good old honey-do fashion that it seemed all married men used. Duct tape and screws. She giggled in her throat then, remembering all the honey-do fix-its that her father had performed, cutting corners to save time. She even remembered when he tried painting the duct tape to match the table. Didn't work out so well, if she recalled correctly. Mom had a fit. The dining room, just off the kitchen, displayed a china hutch, glass shattered and more graffiti reading Rico adorning the front. Charming, she thought sarcastically to herself. Pinstriped wallpaper tattered the room, like claws had ripped through it in protest of the pattern chosen. Off the dining room was an office, children's toys strewn about as though they had just been there, were it not for the grime, dust, and mold. The Tudor-style desk sat to the far right, papers decorating the top and floor about as though somebody were having a tantrum or a party. The dining room led to the living area through a T-shaped arch, trinkets and knickknacks neatly in their places on the adjacent shelves, blanketed in dust. It was an eerie sight to behold, ghostly. Furniture had been overturned, holes chewed into most of it by rats, cut up by transients and thugs. Everything was in its place, and somehow wasn't. Light seeped through the cracks in the walls like a silver halo, threading over the room in beams of veiled dust, climbing up walls and over ceilings like the fingers of some ghastly creature. The stairs creaked and groaned beneath her feet, making her think twice about climbing them further. The holes adorned the walls where pictures had once hung neatly in place. There was only one room when she reached the top, oddly free of furniture of any kind, but the room looked like it belonged at one point to children. The walls were painted in an off-tone blue screaming with pink painted ribbons and stars on the ceiling. The closet door hung open, barely hanging by its hinges, with nothing inside but blackness. Unsure if she should venture further, she cautiously stepped forward to peer inside. Her heart raced inside her chest, knowing too well what the darkness brought. And what it brought was never pleasant. Nothing. Just empty and bleak. A simple, ordinary child's closet. Nothing remarkable to speak of, save for the pitch black inside. With a shudder, she stepped out and closed the door. Awkwardly, her attention now focused on the wood floor beneath her. The planks, molded and rotting away, separating to reveal an uncomfortable darkness beneath. Loose and wobbly, the boards groaned and sank beneath her feet as she walked over them, peering between them to reveal a mysterious blue. She halted suddenly at the familiar shade and cringed inwardly. It couldn't be. Stepping adjacent, she ripped the remnants of lace curtains tattered and torn from the small rectangular window, allowing enough light to peer into the room and illuminate the floor. She needed only a moment to let her eyes adjust to what it was she was looking at, before even realizing she had lost the will to stand. Her knees hit the rotting floor with a loud thud. She just sat there now, trying not to cry. Anger, fierce and wild, welled up inside of her, with an intensity matched only by the urge to run and never look back. But she couldn't do that. With a scream loud enough to wake the dead, she began to pound relentlessly on the rotting wood until it gave beneath her fists, cracking and groaning, splintering and buckling, revealing its long hidden secrets. The hole was big enough now for a small person to fit into. Tears soaked her face and her hands stung and bled. Hair fallen from its catchings now clung to her face as she sobbed. All she could do was cry as she stared down at the blackened, shriveled bodies of two twin girls, their faces twisted with fear, one sister's hand clasping the other's. They wore a light blue dress with a bow around the waist and a blue ribbon around their loose hanging hair. Little black slippers on their tiny feet, with frilly socks to accent the dress. Heather and Marian Ingram, found at last. She wanted to die then. Leaning back, she put her head against the wall and just sat there. She sat staring at nothing from the back of an ambulance, her hands stinging and wrapped with gauze. Her face was filthy, streaked with dirt and tears, her hair still clinging to it from her earlier fit. In front of her stood Moore. She wasn't sure yet if this was good or bad. "I remember this place," he began as he stared up at the derelict house, his hands on his hips. "We searched every damn inch of it, top to bottom, front to back." He trailed off as though he were reliving the search itself. Not once did we even consider those poor girls were buried in the floors. He ran his hand over his face and looked at Frankie. "You okay, kid?" She wasn't positive how to answer. She wasn't okay. She'd survive, but she wasn't okay. "I'm fine, thank you." It wasn't true, but it would have to settle. She stared down the street where a crowd had gathered a few moments earlier. It astounded her that wherever there was tragedy, there were eyes eager to see it. Humanity was a loss in its entirety, she thought. Did she mean it? At this point, she couldn't tell. She turned her gaze to the trees in the distance and couldn't help but wonder how beautiful they must look at night. Night. Something she hadn't seen since she was a child. The skyline glowed a bright yellow now, and her concern began to rise like a knot lodging in her stomach. It would be dark soon. She needed to get home. "Officer Moore," she began. He stared intently at the second-floor windows, his face a mask of dread and self-loathing. "Call me Bert," he replied, his eyes staying fixed where they were. "I need to get home soon," she said quietly, turning her head upward to try and see what had his attention. "How many times," he began softly, "how many times did I just walk right over him? Never in a million years would I've known, but you knew." He seemed almost frustrated with her. Was it her he grew angry with, or himself? Perhaps the question was best left for another time. "You couldn't have known," she tried to console him, touching his arm. "Yeah," he replied quickly as he choked back his emotion. "So it was the damn parents after all, and now they're wasting away in an old folks' nut hut. Couldn't arrest or prosecute if we tried. Fantastic. Those girls, they died horribly. And they go without justice even now," he said as he stared up. Was there really any way at all to explain that the parents were indeed innocent? Would he believe her if she tried? Just then, a coroner's van backed onto the lawn. She hadn't even noticed they arrived. She watched intently as two gentlemen entered the home with body bags draped over their arms like they were jackets. So casual were they that Frankie almost lost sight of what they were there to do. Pink and purple hues began to decorate the horizon now. It had been so long since she had seen the dusk that she had forgotten how beautiful it was, especially this time of year. With all she had missed in her life, there were times she couldn't help but wonder if she was being punished somehow for some dastardly act she was unaware of committing. Perhaps in a different life, if there were indeed such a thing. Christ, I can't believe this, Bert said as he worried his bald spot with his bare hand. Frankie almost wanted a comical squeak to erupt when he did it, but alas. Damn nightmare is what this is. A goddamn nightmare, he finished. If he only knew, she thought. And she hoped it wasn't out loud. More faces appeared in the growing crowd. It was beginning to feel like a show. These poor little girls were becoming an attraction. It embarrassed and disgusted her at the same time. Moore seemed used to it. Part of his job, she thought. But how could someone get used to something like that? All those people turning despair and hurt, tragedy and loss into entertainment. They gawked on as though it were fun. She wondered then if any of the older faces she saw knew the girls, if any of them even understood what was happening here. She couldn't imagine any human being would still be standing there, watching like it was a television crime drama if they knew. She wanted to have more faith in the human race than that. It didn't take long for the coroners to emerge from the house carrying the same bags, a man at each end holding separate the corners, as normal procedure would indicate, and yet the bags looked as empty as when they went inside. It would have taken a skilled eye to be aware that there was anything inside them at all. Frankie cringed inwardly and looked away. "Don't worry, Miss Welch," Bert began as he finally freed his gaze from the window to match hers. "We're going to get you home." He looked at her with a mixture of question and fear. There was something he wanted to ask her, and she could see it, almost as clearly as she could see his discomfort. "How?" He finally spit it out after staring at her for several moments. She merely raised an eyebrow to his query. "How did you know where to look?" he clarified. She matched his gaze with a blank expression and thought about how to answer. To hell with it, she thought. Just be outright honest. It was the darkest place in the house. She stared at her light switch without blinking, waiting for sleep to come. After the day she had, she wondered if sleep would come at all. How many times had she thought about turning it off? About turning them all off? Wondering if maybe it would help, if maybe it was all in her head and facing the dark would just make it all stop. It seemed so logical, but it had been tried before. Spokane, Washington, 20 years earlier. "Please, Mom, don't let them put me in there. It's dark in there. That's when they come, is in the dark," Frankie pleaded with her mother, who simply stood there holding her hand. "Frankie, honey, that's why we need to do it. So you'll see, sweetie, there's nothing in the dark to be afraid of. It's all bad dreams, baby. You'll see." Frankie turned her attention to the nurses blacking the windows of a very small room recently used for storage. Dr. Anderson had it cleaned out strictly for this experiment, convinced that if she were forced to face her greatest fear, she would no longer fear it. She looked up at her mother, who stood with a blank expression, just watching and holding Frankie's hand. "Mommy," she pleaded, but her mother said nothing. The room was small, with a glass door that opened from the outside. One of the nurses was taking special care to hang a giant sheet of black plastic over it, covering every possible inch that light could come through. She noticed Frankie watching and gave her a sweet, comforting smile, and Frankie hated her then. The other nurse was just finishing with the windows. Not a sliver of light shone through them now, and she was beginning to panic already. The only light in the room now was coming from the waiting room as the door hung open, waiting for the smiling nurse to finish. Dr. Anderson emerged from his office a few feet away and offered them a seat across from him as he sat on a brown sofa. Her mother accepted and took a seat across from him. "Okay, Frankie, here's what we're gonna do, kiddo," he started in his most kid-friendly tone. "We're gonna start you off with something super easy. Today, I want you to be really, really brave for me. I need you to sit in that room for just 2 minutes. 2 whole minutes. Can you do that for me?" Frankie looked back at the room as the nurse finally finished the door. "It's dark." "Yeah, I know, but look at it this way. Whenever you're all done with your 2 minutes, you won't have to go back in today. And you'll get to pick out a special toy to take home," Anderson said, raising his eyebrows as though what he said were exciting enough to undertake this venture. She looked at the room again, still clutching her mother's hand. "It's okay, honey," her mother said as she gave her hand a comforting squeeze. She looked at Dr. Anderson and nodded her head, knowing full well it wouldn't take 2 minutes for her to regret it. "Good girl, Frankie. I'm very proud of you," Anderson said. Her mother just smiled and turned her attention to the doctor as he began to speak. "Now, what's going to happen is, today we will do 2 minutes. Then next week we will try 4, then 8, and then so on until we reach an hour. And by that time, she should be able to handle the dark well enough on her own." He sounded so certain as he said it. Frankie wanted to scream. She felt like no one had listened to her at all, ever. Things like shouting or banging and trying to get out should be expected, especially the first time, but no matter what, it's important not to panic. It's important to remember it's only just a couple of minutes, and it is crucial that she overcome her fear, he explained to her mother. She simply nodded and squeezed Frankie's hand. More and more, Frankie hated the sound of this. It looked bad enough. Did he really need to explain anymore? Dr. Anderson gestured them to wait a moment and disappeared into his office. When he came back, he was holding a white lamb with a red bow around his neck. "I thought since your green bear had gotten lost, maybe you'd like this guy." It was almost a question as he handed it to her. "See, he's kind of scared of the dark too, so maybe you two could do this together. I'm sure he would like that. What do you think?" She clutched the stuffed lamb to her chest and nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're very welcome, Frankie. What's his name?" Anderson said gently as he pinched her nose. Frankie grinned, stared intently at her new friend for a moment, thinking deeply. "Yummy," she said with conviction, and nodded. Anderson smiled broadly. What do you say we go ahead and get this over with? He asked her encouragingly, and again she nodded. He gave her a slight smile and took her hand, leading her to the black room. It was the longest short walk she had ever taken. A few short, simple steps had turned into miles of lava and hot coals. The closer they came, the more panic overtook her. The more she fought the urge to cry, the more she wanted to run. He stopped just short and knelt down to face her. Now, if you start to get super scared, just hug the bear really tight. Because remember, Frankie, he's scared too, just like you are, okay? And it would really make Yami feel better, I think, to know that you're there to keep him safe. He was trying to comfort her. He could see on her face she was nearly frozen with fear. And maybe he was afraid for her. He sympathized with the child. In some ways, she reminded him of himself at that age. He didn't have to tell her twice as she hugged the toy so tight to her chest that he thought its head might come off. Don't worry, sunshine. We're going to be right here, outside this door, so no matter what, it's going to be all right. Me and your mom will be right here, he said softly. Frankie just nodded and looked at her mother, her eyes wide and terrified, as though pleading with her one final time not to make her do this. 2 minutes. Anderson gestured to her, pursing his lips and nodding, as though to say she was tougher than she thought. Frankie hugged the lamb under her chin, pinched her eyes shut tight, and stepped into the room, listening to the door behind her. Dr. Anderson took a seat back on the couch across from Frankie's mother. Immediately after the door closed, the girl's breathing had become heavy and rapid. She was beginning to sob in panic, and they could hear her. The small, helpless whimpers of a terrified child, so convinced something was there to get her, echoed uncomfortably. Things like this take time, Mrs. Welch. Time to get used to the idea that what she's scared of just isn't there. As a child, her little mind can come up with things that you and I couldn't even imagine. And for someone so young, hers is very, very active. Frankie just needs to adapt and get used to the dark. He trailed off as the child began to scream, pleading to be let out of the blackness she felt so trapped in. It was beginning to sound like someone was ripping the walls right out of the room. Scratching sounds like talons on concrete and an indescribable thumping as though the devil himself had a heartbeat resonated from the room. It startled even him. He began to wonder to himself, irrationally of course, if perhaps her fears were real. Mrs. Welch simply sat there, her hands folded and white-knuckled on her lap, her eyes shut tight and her lips drawn inward, listening to her child in the next room, wincing and jumping at each loud bang and high-pitched cry for help. Was this what happened at home when the lights went out, he wondered. Calm down, Frankie, sweetie. Just one more minute, kiddo, I promise, Anderson yelled to the closed door. The banging, scratching, and screams were becoming so loud he was unsure if she even heard him. Even he was having great difficulty just sitting there allowing this to go on. It sounded like she was being thrown about the dark room like a rag doll, and as though furniture that wasn't even there was being thrown into walls and ripped to splinters. He wanted to run in there, pick her up and hold her and tell her it was all over and that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. But ethically and logically, he couldn't do that. The nurses that had blacked the room came from behind their counter, wide-eyed and afraid, their hands covering their mouths, listening to the terror coming from it. They turned their gaze to the doctor, as though to say, "Do something." He just shook his head at them and looked at his watch, hoping the time was up. Close enough. With 15 seconds left to go, he stood up and jogged toward the door. Without warning, it exploded outward, hurling the child into the waiting room so hard she hit the front of the sofa and rolled toward her mother. Anderson was knocked to the ground from the force at which Frankie was thrown. Screams erupted from the nurses and mother alike, all rushing to see if she was still alive. The Andersons stared in horror at the room she was in. The walls were shredded to ribbons from top to bottom, every inch. The floor was black and smeared with blood, and carpet had been clawed and ripped up in several places. Even the ceiling sported the same damage the walls and floor had. How could a child do this in less than 2 minutes? "Doctor!" a nurse screamed from across the room. Anderson wasted no time in leaping over furniture to the child's side, praying to whatever God might listen that she was still alive. Anderson was taken aback by what he saw. Frankie's face, chest, back, and arms were clawed to bits. Her left arm was obviously broken, and she was banged up and bruised almost beyond recognition. Anderson found a pulse, a very weak pulse. "Call 911!" he screamed so loud he could swear it was someone else saying it. The nurses both rushed for the counter to get the phone. Frankie's mother knelt on the ground holding her unconscious child, rocking and sobbing with a confused, bewildered, and terrified expression. Anderson stood firm, though terrified for the girl, and he held his emotions well in check until he realized that Frankie was still holding the stuffed animal. It was ages ago, it seemed. She never got over it. She had never been in a dark room or a dark space again. She tore her gaze from the light switch and turned over onto her side, tossing her leg out of the blanket. She took hold of Yami, smiling at all they had gone through together over the years. She kissed his nose, hugged him tight to her chest, and began her nightly battle for sleep.